So I'm going to just welcome everybody to our webinar, and I'm going to ask my colleague Laura Proctor to do the introductions for our webinar today. Laura and I have been working together throughout the week to organize a series of virtual webinars for you, and she's going to host today's session.
Wonderful, thank you, Rayanne. Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited that you've decided to join us this afternoon for our number 3 of our webinar series this week. We're excited to have Bonnie Brandl. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, Bonnie. She is the director of the National Clearinghouse on Abuse and Later in Life. And today she's going to be talking about empowering strategies to support the resiliency of older survivors of intimate partner violence. Next slide. So just a few housekeeping items, now that this is part of our normal life on Zoom. So this is pretty standard practice. During all of our webinars, all of the attendees are muted during the webinar. We will be recording our webinar as we do all of our webinars. And within 24 hours, it will be posted to our website. Just go to the training section of our website and you'll be able to find this webinar. Also, if you need to adjust the size of your screen, you'll see a line in between the presentation and the gallery view. You can drag it either side to make the presentation bigger or the visuals of us bigger. Next slide. So speakers will be visible during the webinar today. And we just ask if you keep all of the question and answers in the Q&A boxes and leave the chat boxes for some of the pro tips we like to post during the webinar. And as well, if you're having any technical issues, we would be more than happy to try and resolve those for you. Also, we do encourage you, there's a very brief evaluation after the session, which will pop up on your screen. And we encourage you to fill out that evaluation. Really gives us a clear idea of webinars moving forward in the future. And of course, at the end of the presentation, all of our contact information is available. And if you have any questions, please do reach out. So I want to take an opportunity to provide a land acknowledgement this afternoon. EAPO endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. We live and work on Métis, Anishwaabeki, Ojibwe, and Cree territories. The presence of settlers is not neutral. It has and continues to have devastating impacts on many aspects of life for Indigenous peoples. Many of our practices, including the way we care for our elders, the way we educate, and our methods of creating community came to these lands through an ongoing process of colonialism. We now hold a new understanding of our interactions and engagement with this land and its people. There is extremely important work being done by many nations and allies to ensure the continued thriving of all communities and knowledge systems. Those of us who are settlers need to recognize that our knowledge and way of doing things may not have been the priority as we work towards a safe Ontario for all seniors. Thank you. So a little bit about us before Bonnie begins her presentation. We are a small nonprofit organization, and I think you would agree that our tagline is "Stop Abuse, Restore Respect," and it's quite simple. All of us have a very important role to play in this community. We are mandated to implement Ontario's strategy to combat elder abuse, and we're generously funded by the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility. Within the strategy to combat elder abuse, there is 3 main priorities, and those priorities are what we're doing today, so public awareness and training, and then coordination of community response and resources through our local elder abuse networks. So today I do want to take an opportunity to recognize that November 25th is International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Today also marks the beginning of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, which concludes on the 10th of December, which is International Day of Human Rights. Violence against women and girls is one of the most widespread and persistent and devastating human rights violations in our world today. Worldwide, it is estimated that 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual abuse within their lifetime. And we all know here today that far too often, older women are forgotten when we talk about violence. And these are our social media posts that we will be posting throughout today, where we truly want to shine a light on the issue that many seniors within an international context suffer on a yearly basis. And these are our virtual events for this week. So tomorrow we have another webinar, which will be focusing on risk assessment. And so we invite you to attend that webinar as well. And then without further ado, I'm more than happy to introduce Bonnie. She's worked in the field of violence against women movement since 1982 and has been with End Abuse since 1991. She has written national curriculum for law enforcement, prosecutors, victim services providers on elder abuse, and facilitated trainings for thousands of professionals throughout the United States. So without further ado, I welcome Bonnie to our webinar this afternoon. Welcome, Bonnie, and we're truly thrilled to have you with us.
Thank you, Laura and Rianne, for inviting me and for organizing this event. And thank you to everyone who is participating today for taking time to think about the needs of older victims of intimate partner violence. Next slide, please. So as was mentioned in the intro, I work for an organization called the National Clearinghouse on Abuse in Later Life that I founded more than 20 years ago. And as part of that work, we work with communities across the country, across the US, more than 100 communities since 2006 who are working at addressing abuse in later life. And the focus of NCAL is really to address the needs at the intersection of domestic violence, sexual assault, and elder abuse. And I've been doing this work for almost 30 years. So the perspective that I'm going to give today is what I've learned over the years, sort of those lessons learned from our work in the United States. Next slide, please. We're going to, in the short time we have together, cover 3 topics. We're going to talk a little bit about intimate partner violence in later life, the impact of ageism on elder abuse, and then move into practical strategies because there are things that you can do to make a difference in the lives of older victims. So we'll start with intimate partner violence. As you may be aware, there are a number of ways that we see intimate partner violence in later life. In some cases, there are long-term relationships that have gone on for 40, 50, 60 years, and the abuse has been occurring throughout the course of that relationship. Maybe it started when they were dating, maybe if they married when they first married, maybe it was with the first baby, but it's been continuing over the course of the relationship. We also see relationships that are new relationships where the people come together in an intimate partner relationship in later life, maybe after a divorce or being widowed, and the relationship is abusive. We also see situations of long-term relationships where the abuse starts later in life. And there are a couple of things if you see that particular circumstance to keep in mind. One is there are some organic conditions like Alzheimer's disease where there's changes in brain chemistry. And in fact, working with a healthcare provider may be helpful because the behaviors that you might be seeing are connected to that organic condition, not rooted in power and control. But I would also encourage you to think about talking with the victim to find out what's really going on. What you might hear her say is, well, he's never hit me before, but I've been on an allowance for the entire course of this marriage. I've only been able to talk to my sister for 7 minutes a month. There are a lot of other dynamics that we see that we would name as intimate partner abuse, even though there might not have been physical violence. One of the reasons it's so important to be talking about this topic today is that when we think about elder abuse broadly, sometimes intimate partner violence really isn't part of the conversation. In the US, what we think about more often are financial exploitation cases. But in fact, international studies have found that many cases of elder abuse, excuse me, a significant portion of them are in fact intimate partner violence. Next slide, please. And that often when we are looking at physical abuse, it in fact, the majority of those cases are the abuser is the partner. Next slide, please. And in cases of sexual abuse, if the abuse is occurring within the community, most often the perpetrator is a spouse or a partner. Next slide, please. So I'd like to start my presentations by hearing from the voices of some older survivors. So here you're going to hear from 3 survivors talking very briefly about what their experience was with intimate partner violence.
I can't tell you when or what snapped in my brain to make me realize love isn't supposed to hurt. Love is supposed to make you feel good. Love doesn't mean that I can slap you around whenever I want to. I can call you out of your name. I can make you feel as low as the lows. Group helped me gain my self-esteem back. I walked proud, you know, my head up. And it made me feel that I'm strong. Felt like I could take on a lion if I had to.
So Rayanne, I wonder, can we pause this video?
Go ahead.
Yeah, let's go ahead and pause the video. I think this is the one I wanted to play at the back end. And so let me just talk a little bit about these 3 cases and then we'll show this video at the back end. So the three cases that you'll see at the very end of this, you'll see Lois, who was physically and sexually abused and participated in services. You also will see Sam, who is a survivor of intimate partner violence, and he went to a domestic violence program 2 different times to get services and help. And then you'll also see a woman named Pat who was in a 50-year relationship. So,
Bonnie, I can play that video now if you want.
Yeah, let's go ahead and see if this is the one. And I apologize that I may have had these in the right.
That was his way of frightening me. He'd run and get his gun, you know. And I would back down. And then the gun, he has gotten a gun at me so many times. When he didn't threaten me with the gun, I would get knocked around, kicked, pushed. He pushed me down the stairs and I caught a hold of the banister and broke my finger. Went to work and lied. And see, I was headed down the step and clutched and I fell and broke my finger.
Was always on the attack, whether it be verbally or physically. And there's many a time where I had to block her punches with my arms. And, or grab whatever she's going to hit me with out of self-defense. So one day I was standing in a doorway and she passed by and I wasn't watching her hands and she had a butcher knife in her hand and she stabbed me in the chest with the butcher knife. Because I had several layers of clothing on, it protected me a great deal, but I still had to go to the hospital.
Well, first of all, started out, he was very, very controlling.
I mean, he didn't want me to go here or there without him, and he didn't approve of, you know, going out with my friends or anything like that. And for the first while, I would say 4 or 5 months, he was very pleasant, but then he started getting real ugly. I mean, he just called me the awfulest names that you can think of, you know.
I always heard my mom referred to as the F word and the C word were used in combination a lot, and I knew those words, you know, from as far back as I can remember. I was so scared myself as a child that it did, and I can explain one of the incidents that caused this fear. I was sitting at a table, much as we are right now, and I was, again, that same small young boy, and I was eating my dinner, and my mom was walking past the table, and he reached over and he took the fork off of my plate that I was eating my food with, and as she walked behind him, he swung around and he buried that fork in her thigh. And as you can imagine, the pain and the fear that took place in my mom, she immediately fell to the ground, and he jumped on top of her and just was, with both fists, he was punching her in the face and the chest. And I thought as a young boy, and as a child, I was so scared that I thought I was going to witness a murder take place right there.
Thank you, Rayanne, for getting us to the correct video, and I apologize for having those in the wrong order this morning. Can we go back to the power and control wheel, which I think is going to be slide 9? And we will meet both of those survivors, those 3 survivors again at the end to hear the difference that services made. But as you could hear in all 3 of those stories, what we saw was really stories where the perpetrator was using power and control and a variety of tactics to gain and maintain power and control. So we heard about physical abuse, we heard about threats. Often other strategies that abusers will use will be isolating the victim or using family members against the victim. In later life, we also see cases often where the abuser will target a person's vulnerabilities. So if someone is using a walker or needs glasses or dentures, hiding or destroying those things that they need. And also in later life, we see them being denied access to things that are particularly important to them, whether it's spiritual practices or connection with the faith community, being able to have things around them that are important to traditions and events. Again, a way of sort of isolating them and treating them with disrespect. Next slide, please. And one of the things that I'm often asked about when I'm talking about intimate partner violence in later life is why would victims stay? Why would they not end these relationships? And as most of you are probably familiar with, usually it's a constellation of reasons, and that these cases are generally very complicated. But we want to be sure to acknowledge and not minimize the fear of harm or being killed or of being placed in a facility in some way. For many victims, they want to maintain connection with that relationship or keep their families intact. In later life, we might see a higher incidence of health status being an issue, that the victim may have health issues and need support for the person who's harming them may also be their caregiver. Or I've heard from many older women that they waited until their children were gone and settled and safe. They were planning on leaving, and then their abuser ended up getting sick. And they decided it was how their values were such that they wanted to stay and help that person through a serious or terminal illness. And in some cases, one or both of the partners has dementia or other issues with cognitive capacity that make the options available a little bit more complicated. Many older victims talk about economic concerns and where will they live and how will they pay for food and rent and other kinds of things. For many older adults, leaving a relationship means that it would be difficult for them to support themselves, and often very difficult at their age to find another job or start a career over or start building resources again. And finally, there are many specific generational, cultural, and societal values that are important to understand and recognize as we get to know and talk with older victims, really understanding all of those intersections in their lives. So next slide, please. So talking about those societal values, I want to spend a little time talking about the impact of ageism on the work that we do, us as professionals and our viewpoint, but also the impact of ageism on older adults and the rest of society, and how this is directly connected to elder abuse. Next slide, please. So before I get into ageism, let's start with 10 great benefits that we gain as we age, because there are many, many positive things about aging, and research that's been done really supports there are some great things that many of us gain as we age. Certainly health status and economic status make a difference. So what I'm about to say isn't going to be true for everyone, but for many of us, one of the great benefits is that we are more positive. We hold ourselves, our self-esteem is higher than it might have been when we were younger because we have more lived experience. We have a more positive sense of emotional stability. And some of that comes because as our brain chemistry and the way our brains work as they get older changes. So it might be harder for me to remember your name or to find that word. It often will come to me eventually, but some of those things might be slower. But because of the changes in the way the brain operates, it's easier to set priorities. Next slide, please. And to use our life circumstances to see the big picture and have a wiser perspective. So sometimes for many of us in later life, we tend to not get caught up in the drama of things that might have been upsetting or hard to power through when we were younger. We can see more of the good and ignore the bad and recognize there's sort of an ebb and flow, and it helps us have more acceptance of life, and for those of us who are working, a higher work satisfaction. Next slide, please. So given all of that research that would indicate that there are so many positive benefits to aging, why is it that ageism really affects people of all ages? Next slide, please. Ageism, like racism and sexism, is a form of prejudice. It's a form of oppression that not only limits people who are the object of the oppression, meaning older people themselves, but it shapes the perception that people have, no matter what age they are, and promotes ageist attitudes. And these, unfortunately, these attitudes that we have about older people start from a very early age. Next slide. Like racism and sexism, ageism really serves as a social and economic purpose to legitimize and sustain inequities between groups. So it's not about how we look, it's about how people in power and people who have an economic reason for wanting to promote an ageist agenda assign meaning to how we look and what aging means. So if you can convince me that wrinkles are bad instead of good, you can convince me to go out and buy something and spend my money on ways to get rid of wrinkles, or to dye my hair if it's gray, if I believe that that's a negative thing to look old. Pharmaceutical companies can try to convince me that there are medications and things that I need. So we need to look at ageism like we would at many of the other isms, that people in power and people who can benefit from this will promote messages that can be damaging to all of us in terms of ageist beliefs. And these messages are everywhere. It's in the greeting card aisle. Next slide, please. Where we see things, cards that say things like happy birthday, oh no, you're old, as if that's a bad thing. Next slide. It's in the words we use. Next slide, please. I'm having a senior moment, for example, making jokes about being forgetful when, yes, I may be forgetful today, but I was also forgetful in my 20s. Next slide, please. It's in the advertisements that we see. Next slide, please. Here's an example of one, the old bag you'll actually love. And ageism, we have found, at least in the US, that ageism during COVID has been particularly amplified in terms of the dialogue that's out there. Next slide, please. Here's an example of one of the messages that we've seen in the US, people protesting the shutting down of the economy and wanting to sacrifice the weak and reopen the state so that restaurants and other places can be open. There have been numerous ageist messages on social media, statements made by leaders and politicians and others that really, while ageism was always prevalent and an issue that we were trying to deal with in this movement, this past year, we really, in my mind, have gone significantly back in terms of promoting healthy images of older adults, and have not done nearly enough in the US to be confronting these ageist messages. And the problem here is that over a lifetime, ageist messages and assumptions harden into a belief system. This is what we start to think. We see older people and we believe that they're incompetent. We believe that wrinkles are ugly, and we believe that it's sad to be old, and people become afraid of getting old. And we internalize this ageism, feeling shame and embarrassment, instead of really taking pride in the accomplishment of aging and all the positives that could come with it. And there are significant problems to internalized ageism. It blinds us to the benefits of aging and heightens our fear. It makes it much harder than it needs to be for us to grow older. And we end up with a damaged sense of self, feeling inferior and not respected. Many of my older friends talk about feeling invisible when they go into stores and restaurants, that younger people might be acknowledged or served by the people working there before them. And so we end up feeling segregated and our prospects being diminished. And when we internalize those values as older people, it has a significant impact, unfortunately, on us. Research would indicate that older people with a positive age bias are 44% more likely to recover from a severe disability. And that older adults with positive self-perceptions of aging live 7.5 years longer than older adults with a less positive self-perception of aging. These are significant benefits to quality of life that are being taken away by the ageist messaging that is being promoted. And then let's bring it back to the topic that we're talking about today, which is abuse in later life. Unfortunately, ageism creates a culture that ignores and tolerates elder abuse and allows the abuse of older adults to flourish and to grow. So if we're going to be thinking about what can we do to make a difference in working with older adults, one of the things we're going to want to be thinking about is that one of these root causes of ageism, and how we can figure out how to address the messaging that's out in society. So with all of that in mind, let's take a few moments to talk about what we can do as individuals, both personally and professionally, to make a difference. Because really, the good news here is there is a lot that we can do to make a difference in the lives of older victims and older adults. And the first thing is making connection and having it be a consistent connection and providing social support to people. And especially in the pandemic where older adults are even more isolated, sending cards, doing Zoom calls, talking on the phone, checking on neighbors, friends, and family makes a huge difference. Because what studies have shown is that social support can reduce the effects of abuse, particularly in terms of depression and symptoms of anxiety and poor health. But it also can be a preventative strategy. Abusers often are looking for older adults who maybe are going to be unlikely to report or believe or may not have anyone watching and keeping an eye on what's going on. And so if they see an older adult with a lot of connection, they may move on to someone else where they think that they can more successfully isolate them. So this is I'm missing the the pictures that I want here, and I apologize for that. But let me talk a little bit about universal education, and I can make sure that you have a link to the resources that that we have put together on this topic. Another thing, in addition to social connection that we can do, is name it and talk about elder abuse. And so one of the things that I have found is just having conversations with older adults and family members where I talk about the job that I do, or I talk about a training that I went to, and say, you know, this is a serious issue for us, and there are resources that out there that can be helpful. And if you know someone who's being harmed, please let me know. I'd be happy to help and talk to people about that. And so with this universal education strategy, rather than asking older adults directly, is someone hurting you or do you feel safe? Often older adults are going to backpedal from that and maybe not respond. But we've created a safety card with Futures Without Violence, where instead we have some written information and some questions that people can ask verbally about how things are going, and are there times when people you trust or love hurt or harm you, and about relationships in your health and how people are coping with stress, fear, and pain. So getting at these more general issues will sometimes be a way to open the door to get to questions, to get information about if harm is happening. There's also some information on this card, a little information about safety planning and legal resources and ideas for healing and connection, and resources as well. If during these conversations that you're having, the connection that you're making, or just sort of talking generally about abuse in later life occurring, or if you see some risk factors and signs that abuse might be occurring, it is important to find ways to gently ask questions of people privately. You may not get a disclosure right away, but what older victims have said to me is that someone asking and noticing is an intervention in and of itself. They may not respond in that moment, but they may be willing to tell you or someone else later, because that is one of the steps to them trying to figure out what they want to do. You can consider if there are other strategies that you can use to help break the isolation. You can focus on the strengths and resiliency and the natural allies, the family, friends, or neighbors who might already be involved in this older adult's life. I think it's really important simply to message to victims that they are not alone and that help is available, and refer them to hotlines, because often the first place an older person might want to go is talking to someone confidentially and using a free hotline. And in cases of, if you're either a mandated reporter or if you're concerned about a life-threatening situation, of course, consider reporting. So there are other things that you can do professionally and in terms of thinking about this issue as well. So sometimes how we frame an issue and how we recognize we live in an ageist society and what messages might we have internalized that impact our work. I think we really want to pause and take a breath and try to think some things through in terms of how we frame things. So next slide, please. One of the first things I think it's important to do is think about, as a professional, what is your role in terms of working with older adults? So for law enforcement, or for in the states, we have social workers in adult protective services roles. There are people whose job it is to focus on protecting older adults and keeping them safe. And then there are others of us who work in fields of advocacy and victim services or the Aging Services Network, where our role is really more about walking alongside a victim and letting them choose the path that they want, and really focusing on self-determination and autonomy. Next slide, please. And so the challenge, I think, often in this field is balancing that protection and safety. There are some older adults who are unable to protect themselves due to health issues or dementia or for whatever other reasons. And we need to think about, in those cases, how we can be sure that people are getting the protections that they need. But at the same time, I find that sometimes professionals move in more quickly with interventions and things that they want to see happen with older adults than they would with a younger person, and maybe a little more quickly than might be necessary. Because certainly what we know when we work with victims is that they respond best, like all of us do, to being able to make the decision on their own. So if you hand someone a plan and tell them to implement it, they're much more less likely to implement it than if they create the plan themselves and you walk alongside them. And this is complicated with all victim services, but I think especially true with older adults. And another thing that I think is really helpful in terms of our frame is that some of the tools that are out there that help us try to figure out how to respond focus on what's wrong with the person instead of what they're doing well. And so we start, if we're looking at tools that talk about all of the different ways people can be harmed and the limitations that they might have, without balancing that out with what they're doing well and what their strengths are, we focus on simply seeing the problem instead of seeing the person in front of us. And so I encourage you to really try to focus on an intersectional approach where you see the whole person. You're asking questions about their life and what's important and their values. What have they done to stay safe in the past? What can they do moving forward? And I think we build stronger connection when we see a person in front of us rather than simply a problem. And then for me, one of the things that this is sort of the phrase that I use when I'm thinking about how to best interact with older victims who may be making choices that aren't the choice that I would make. I've had to learn to just walk in the dark, if you will, that I don't know what the future is. I may have heard a story from him and he may have told me all of these things, and then he is still going to go back into that relationship, or she has, told me about life-threatening things and has decided to live separately, but still maintain contact for a bunch of reasons. And I will hear all of that and be afraid for people sometimes. And I will want something for them that is really my own agenda. And what I've had to learn to do is step back, and I can't see what's out in front of me. This is the learning to walk in the dark piece for me. I don't know what the future holds, no matter what choice that older adult makes. But I need to let them continue to walk on their journey. And if it doesn't turn out the way that they want, be there as a person who can support them on whatever the next stage is. It is not uncommon for victims to take a few steps one way and a few steps back. And it's sort of often a back and forth process, as relationships often are. And so for me to be constant in my support, even if people are making decisions that may not make the most sense to me. For those of you who do victim services, I think a couple of tips as you're thinking about how to best work with older adults. I start by listening to older adults. I found in the work that I do, if I sit in my office alone, have fabulous ideas. And if I sit in a room with younger professionals and myself, we have fabulous ideas. When I talk to older adults, I sometimes find that they agree that the idea is fabulous, but it doesn't really make a difference for them or help them in the same way. So listening to older adults, learning about who's living in your community, what different racial and ethnic populations, faith communities are there, and where are different populations going in terms of getting help and services, and then trying to figure out, based on all that you've learned, having people take a look at your policies and your practices and your materials and giving you advice about how you can tailor your services and be creative, which I know is especially true as we're moving through the pandemic. And the other question that I would ask older adults is, what's the best way to get information to them, and making sure that we're meeting meeting them where they are at and talking to them as an audience about intimate partner violence. I've seen a number of victim service providers talk to a room where there's older adults, but all of their stories are about moms and kids. All of the images that they put up are about victims who are 18 to 40 years old. And so older adults think, your services are great for my granddaughter, but may not be right for me. And so we just have to really think about our messaging. And then in addition to talking with older adults in the research that we do, it is collaborating with other professionals from other disciplines. These cases generally are very complicated, and to learn what folks from the Aging Services Network and from victim services and from the justice system and faith communities and other places, if we're working together, we will learn more about other resources and options and ways that we can provide different ideas and different people that may be able to make a connection with the older adult. And so it really, next slide please, means moving out of the silos that we often work in and try to think about how we can collaborate most effectively, whether that's individual professionals coming together over coffee or over Zoom nowadays and talking together about your services, whether it is a multidisciplinary team where you're doing case coordination and working an individual case together, or if you're doing what we call a coordinated community response in the States, which is a group coming together and looking at doing macro level work. All of those ways get us out of our silos and help us be more effective with victims. Next slide, please. And then tying us back to the section on ageism, for those of us who do macro level work, there's a lot of opportunity to be providing education on intimate partner violence in later life. As I said, often when people are talking about elder abuse, the focus tends to be much more on financial exploitation. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about intimate partner violence in later life and great opportunities to provide information. And all of us can be doing all we can to confront ageism, because until we get at that sort of root issue, sadly, I think we're going to continue to see elder abuse and intimate partner violence in later life continue and grow. So we have some tools at NCALT that might be helpful. You're going to see some great resources that you've got in Canada as well, but I just wanted you to be aware that our website is available, and we have a forum that you can participate in, and a newsletter and all of the social media options as well. Next slide, please. One of the projects that I have had a privilege to work on has over the years with the Office for Victims of Crime and Terra Nova Films is going out and filming older survivors like the three we saw at the beginning of this presentation. If you go to this Lifting Up Voices of Older Survivors website, there are some newer videos, 9 that we have done in the last couple of years. And so if you're a trainer or an educator, these stories can be a great way to get the message out. Next slide. And we also have a video library of lots of professionals talking about a variety of issues. So sometimes it's nice if you're a trainer to talk for a little while and then put someone else on the screen. And so this can be a great option for education as well. And then finally, we also have a bunch of awareness materials, World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. And in the US, we have a Stalking Awareness Month, Sexual Violence Awareness Month, and Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we put together a number of materials that are available to anybody to use if that would be helpful. So let's go back to Rayanne, if you could figure out which is the video that I want to show at the end. I think it's the one we started with. So we're going to again see Pat, we're going to see Lois, Sam, and Pat in that order, and all of them have received services from a victim service provider. And here's what they would say to you about their life after services.
I can't
Sorry.
tell you when or what snapped in my brain to make me realize love isn't supposed to hurt. Love is supposed to make you feel good. Love doesn't mean that I can slap you around whenever I want to. I can call you out of your name. I can make you feel as low as the lows. Group helped me gain my self-esteem back. I walked proud, you know, my head up. And it made me feel that I'm strong. Felt like I could take on a lion if I had to. The group helped me to be a survivor, and I am.
The reunion? Well, it was like Christmas all over again. My daughter came up for Father's Day, and she came here and she brought me all kinds of presents. And she saw the apartment itself, and she started buying stuff for the apartment, and spent 3 days together here with her two big boys. She's got a boy of 15 and one is 13, but they're love guys, you know. Hey, Grandpa, we love you type thing, you know. I just eat that up. I love it. So it's great. It's really great.
And so I go home, and like last night, I sat down and I drank that fuzzy navel, watched the ball game, and I woke up at 10 minutes to 2 in my chair, and I hadn't even had my supper.
So as you can see from those stories, the services made a difference in terms of being these victims being treated with respect and dignity. They went from feeling afraid to Lois feeling like a lion, she could take on a lion. Pat, who had been controlled for more than 50 years, found she could do what she wanted to do, watch a ball game, drink a fuzzy navel, fall asleep in her chair, and that had certainly not been her life for 50 years, where he controlled where she went, who she talked to, what she did. And Sam, as I said, you stated a domestic violence program twice and ended that relationship, and as a result was able to reconnect with his daughter. So services can make a difference, connection can make a difference. There's a lot that we can do to help prevent some of this from happening by ongoing connection and by supporting and intervening when we can. So on that note, Rhiannon and Laura, I'm going to close out and see if we have any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for the very informative presentation. We truly appreciate it. We are getting some question and answer, and I'll pass it off to my colleague, Rayanne, to take the lead on these.
Great. So we did have a couple people inquiring about the safety card that you mentioned. We did put the link in our chat box. So I put the general website as well as Laura put the exact site, so you can click on that. We'll also put that on our website when we post the webinar, as well as the PowerPoint tomorrow or later today. So we do have a question. How can ageism in institutional organizations best be addressed?
What a great question. And I'll let you guys help answer as well if you've got other ideas. So, some of it, I would say, depends a little bit on the organization and the culture of the organization, but I find education to be a really good way to start. There might be some training that can be done depending on the organization you're working on and the staff. There can be some great, if you do lunch and learns or book groups and you read some things together, choosing some books that would address this topic or movies. I think regular ongoing conversations and finding ways, if people are making jokes or saying things, to find ways to call that out. And I think it's really important to look at practices and policies, what might be written into your handbook and other things that maybe haven't taken on the lens of looking at what that impact might be on an older adult. Laura and Rianne, do you have other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and it's it starts as, you know, it's sometimes can be a culture of, as you were mentioning, not only within society but within organizations and care facilities, institutional settings of that. So it's sort of getting in there and stopping it when it starts to happen, and letting people know that it's not accepted. And you know, yeah, I think. And there's different programs and ways that you can get that out there through, you've showed some examples of awareness campaigns, even posters, and people calling people out on ageist remarks or behaviors, I think is important. And if it's not maybe staff, it could be family members doing you know, being ageist. So I think it goes both ways. Anybody who's going into the facility to either visit or work as well. So the next question we had is walking in the dark different with being a professional versus a family member? And how do I be okay with the damage?
That is such a great question. That is a great question. And I would say that the only way it's, in my own experience, that it's been different is that it's harder when it's a family member. And because it gets at the back end of your question, right? How am I okay with if it's my mom or my grandmother or another family member that is being harmed? I will say that I came into this work because of my grandmother being a victim of intimate partner violence. So I appreciate the question that you're asking, and where I landed, and everyone sort of ends up landing where they in their own place. But what I found was that the more I try to tell people what to do and push my own values on them, the less they connect with me and the less likely they are to sort of follow my advice or plan. That just like how I operate in my life when I'm stuck on things, I really want someone to listen and hear me and guide me and then support me as I go through the bumpy parts of life, and that victims are no different in that way. And that being consistent and loving them, and realizing that in life we don't get to control the outcomes. And if you've done that, if you have been supportive and compassionate, and it still doesn't work out the way that you want, you have to just figure out how to sort of let it go. And I get how hard that is. Mm-hmm. I get how hard that is.
Yeah, I have to agree. It is more difficult when it is family to do some interventions and some of the this balancing that. And you know, you were talking about before about balancing, you know, safety, autonomy, and choices. That's sometimes it's difficult when it comes to family. Another interesting question in talking about sort of the differences between Canada and the United States was, how has the COVID pandemic highlighted aspects of elder abuse and neglect in North America? You know, in the different ways that you talked about, and, you know, mentioned that in your presentation around that. I was actually quite shocked with that sign that you showed that somebody had as one of the protests. That was quite, yeah, set me back a bit. I was like, wow.
Yeah, I'm hoping that the dialogue in Canada is so much different than the dialogue that it's been in the States. So between the pandemic and then our election of having two older men running for president, and the jokes on social media, late night comedians on both that and the pandemic, it has just been it has been shocking. Rianne, ask me the question again, though, because I feel like I lost the question. So when you mentioned the sign, I just went off on my own thing.
Well, because it was so shocking. So how has the COVID pandemic highlighted aspects of elder abuse and neglect in North America?
So I think a couple of things that we've seen in the US. One has been that obviously when you tell people to shelter at home with an abuser, that there's increased risk there. There's been increased risk in facilities because there aren't family and friends and eyes and ears and people that can keep an eye on and be helpful. And then as our economy is struggling, there's increased financial exploitation. And one of the things that we've seen is that the media has really picked up on domestic violence with younger victims and talked about that issue in the pandemic. But in our country, and I think Canada's doing much better than this, in our country, there's been very little conversation about older adults in the media and elder abuse and the connection with that to the pandemic. And then I think the elder justice field in the US is so much smaller than the violence against women field and the child abuse field, which has way more money and resources and staffing, that when a pandemic comes, we have so little money and support and structures that what little was there is crumbling, and it's difficult to get on the agenda of policymakers when there's so many other competing issues. And so for me, it has really shown why we need to be lifting this issue up much more and bringing more people and other professionals into the conversation so that we can impact getting policymakers to change some laws and more resources coming to this issue.
Right, and I think we've seen that in Canada with, within the care facilities of bringing the highlight around the abuse and neglect that has happened in care facilities. So with the COVID, it's kind of brought everything to the forefront, where we talked about it before, similar to the States, and now it's right in everyone's, in their living rooms, basically, with radio and television. So as someone else commented, how in Canada, how it has been widespread in our care facilities. I like the comment that you made around, that it's neighbors, friends, and families that can pay attention to things that are happening, and that maybe situations may not come to the attention of service providers. And we do something similar in Ontario as well as in Canada, where we have a program, Neighbors, Friends, and Families is what it's called. And it's called the It's Not Right campaign, to engage people in that conversation. So I'm going to go back and look at your safety card, because I think those are the same messages that we're kind of promoting as well in our country too, in trying to get people engaged as a bystander, basically. And as this is an important issue that's coming up. One of the questions that another person is asking is, does the US have a national elder abuse strategy? And if not, any work on that being done?
So I was part of what we call the Elder Justice Roadmap, which is sort of, so that was in, you lose track of time in a pandemic, right? And so I'm going to guess a year, but it's got to be much further back than that. I don't know, maybe 2012 is the year that we worked on that. So it's been around for a number of years. And it was funded by the Department of Justice and HHS, where we did a concept mapping process and then put a document together with a number of recommendations. And so shortly after that came out, there was a lot of work on the local, state, and some work on the national level to begin to implement some of those priorities. But we have not been able to find the funding since that roadmap was created to go back and document the successes and where the gaps are still occurring, and then build more resources to be able to fill that in. But it is something that I think is really important, and that and the time has come for us to come back to do that. My understanding is Canada just drafted one recently, yes? And
we're working on it.
You're working on it.
Yes, we're working on it, and we've also looked at your recent roadmap. So I don't know the year, but I remember looking at it just the other day.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because I know a lot of people who have said to me that they do still use it on the local level. And I would guess, just from what I remember of the process, that if I were to go back and look at it closely, I would be really proud of some of the successes that we've had, which is what's great about a roadmap. But I would see many of the same gaps and challenges. And it was such a great way to bring us together and have conversation. So I love that you're bringing people together and having those conversations about moving forward together. We're much stronger if we're moving forward together as opposed to all of our silos.
There's just another question about, how do you see the seniors are affected in terms of immigrants and Indigenous people?
So both in terms of COVID and elder abuse, that the challenges are so much greater for both in the U.S. With the immigrant population, they're already, because of over the last few years, some of the immigration policies that we've had, there's a lot of fear about being deported, and so the fear of going out and getting tested for COVID, the fear of reporting if you're a victim of abuse. There are lots of stories of people trying to stay and make things work in an elder abuse situation because of the immigration status being a barrier. And then the same in Indigenous communities. We've done some work with tribal communities, and we have a document on our website called Reclaiming What is Sacred. And what we learned during the listening session we did for that document and the process that we put together is that in many communities, talking about elder abuse was a relatively new thing, and because of culture's honoring of elders, sometimes the abuse that was occurring may be even more hidden there, and so there were some complexities and fewer resources to help them address the issues that they were experiencing.
Thanks, Donnie. And I would encourage everyone to go to the NCAL website. They do have some excellent resources and some research that's being done in the States, just in terms of some of those issues that you were just mentioned. I know I go to that site as well just to look for other current research in there. And we do post some of your information in our newsletters that's coming out. I think there was one recently that I posted about a new update on some statistics and things like that. So I want to thank you for joining us. Just before we end though, I am going to ask Laura just to mention a few of our services that we have in Ontario to assist individuals, and then we'll wrap up.
Absolutely, thank you, Rayanne. So I do want to highlight some of our provincial resources we have here. So for any policing issues, we strongly encourage using Crime Stoppers. It's anonymous, as well as your local police department. So that could be Ontario Provincial Police, Toronto Police, and each municipal police department typically has a vulnerable persons coordinator. Next slide. And then around reporting, as many of you are aware online today, is that the only two mandatory report sites here in Ontario is those that live in long-term care homes or within retirement homes. There is no mandatory reporting on elder abuse within the general community. So we encourage you, if you know a loved one in long-term care or retirement who is suffering elder abuse, please reach out to the Retirement Home Regulatory Authority or the Long-Term Care Action Line. And then there's some other support services here. So the Ontario Caregiver Association is a wonderful support for all of our hardworking and overworked caregivers during the pandemic. They have a lot of great resources, and they also have a helpline, which is very helpful. And you can see it here at 1-833-416-2273. And then as well as the Alzheimer's Society is a great link for support, as well as Family Services Toronto. And then we too have tools and resources. We've been busy during the pandemic, increasing our social media postings. So I encourage everyone to visit our website, and you can download our very own safety planning toolkit and some COVID-19 frauds and scams resource sheets. And then of course, I need to plug our webinars that is coming up tomorrow. And we are lucky to have Margaret McPherson and Tracy Marshall speaking around managing risk for domestic homicide of older adults in the community, and around the same concept that Bonnie really discussed this afternoon around we all have a role to play. So I encourage you to attend that. And then we are ending our week with a recognition award for Victims of Crime Week. And then we also are lucky to have Nadine Prince on Friday as well at 11 a.m. talking about the Victim Witness Assistance Program and how they assist vulnerable seniors through the court process. And then, of course, one more webinar. We have a couple more webinars before Christmas, and this is around the rights of older adults within long-term care. I encourage you to go to our website. You can sign up to be on our mailing list, and then you will not miss any of these opportunities. So I do want to thank everyone for attending. This is our social media information. Ryan and myself, our direct contact information if you want to reach out with any questions that you may have. So again, thank you very much for attending today, and everyone be well. Thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you again, Bonnie, for all your work and hard work. And Bonnie's retiring, so we wish you well as in your retirement in the new year. And we will, I'm sure, continue to collaborate and work with you in the future on a different way. So thank you again, everybody, for participating for today's webinar.
Take care.